My passport application was denied because I'm already a citizen of a country I've never visited. The letter from the State Department arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was packing for a business trip to London. I'd applied for passport renewal 3 weeks earlier because my old one was expiring in 2 months. Standard procedure I'd done twice before without issues. The envelope felt heavier than expected, and when I opened it, instead of a new passport, I found a denial letter with bureaucratic language that made no sense. Your application for a United States passport has been denied under Title 22, Section 5170 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Our records indicate you currently hold active citizenship with the Republic of Moldova and have not completed the required renunciation process before applying for U.S. citizenship documentation. Please contact the Office of Consular Affairs for further information regarding your dual citizenship status. I read it 3 times because the words didn't connect to anything in my reality. Moldova. I'd never been to Moldova. I'd never even thought about Moldova beyond vaguely knowing it existed somewhere in Eastern Europe. I was born in Seattle, raised in Portland, lived my entire 34 years in the Pacific Northwest. My parents were American. My grandparents were American. There was no Moldova anywhere in my family tree. I called the number listed on the denial letter and spent 40 minutes navigating automated menus before reaching a human being. The woman who answered identified herself as Patricia from Passport Services and asked for my application reference number. I gave it to her, and she pulled up my file. Yes, Mr. Brennan, I see your application was flagged due to conflicting citizenship records. Our system shows you as a registered citizen of Moldova with an active passport issued through their embassy in 2019. You'll need to formally renounce that citizenship before we can process your U.S. passport application. Her tone suggested this was routine, a simple administrative matter. I told her there was a mistake, that I'd never been to Moldova, never applied for citizenship there, never even left the United States except for one trip to Canada when I was 16. Patricia's voice became slightly less bureaucratic. Mr. Brennan, I'm looking at documentation here that shows you were registered as a Moldovan citizen in 2019 with your full name, date of birth, and social security number. The registration came through their embassy in Washington, D.C. If this is fraudulent, you'll need to file a dispute with the State Department's Fraud Division and potentially with Moldovan authorities. I asked how someone could register me as a citizen of a foreign country without my knowledge or consent. Patricia explained that many countries allow citizenship registration based on ancestry or other qualifying factors, and that sometimes people discover they have dual citizenship they weren't aware of. But this wasn't ancestry. I had no connection to Moldova. Someone had used my information to create a fraudulent citizenship record. Patricia gave me a case number and transferred me to the Fraud Division, where I left a detailed voicemail because nobody answered. Then I called my boss at the software company where I worked as a project manager and explained I couldn't make the London trip because I had no passport. He was annoyed but said we'd reschedule. I spent the rest of the day researching Moldova and trying to understand how this could have happened. Moldova was a small landlocked country between Romania and Ukraine, formerly part of the Soviet Union. Population about 2.6 million, one of the poorest countries in Europe, and according to several articles I found, Moldova had a problem with citizenship fraud schemes where people bought passports for travel convenience or to avoid legal issues in their home countries. I found references to organized crime groups that facilitated fake citizenship documents and to corrupt officials who processed fraudulent applications for bribes. But none of the articles explained why someone would register an American citizen who'd never left the country. What was the benefit? I called my parents that evening to ask if they knew anything about Moldova or Eastern European connections in our family. My mother was confused by the question and insisted our family was Irish and German going back generations. My father said he'd never heard of Moldova until now and suggested I hire a lawyer because this sounded like identity theft. I spent the next morning searching for attorneys who specialized in passport fraud and found a law firm in Seattle that handled international identity cases. I made an appointment for that afternoon with an attorney named Gregory Nash. Gregory's office was downtown in a building overlooking Elliott Bay. He was in his 50s with the careful demeanor of someone who'd seen unusual cases before. I explained the situation and showed him the denial letter. He read it thoroughly and asked detailed questions about my background, my family history, and any travel I'd done. When I finished, Gregory leaned back in his chair and said something that made my stomach drop. "Mr. Brennan, I've handled maybe 5 cases similar to yours in the past decade. Every single one involved organized fraud rings that register Americans as citizens of countries with lax documentation requirements. They use that fraudulent citizenship to facilitate money laundering, sanctions evasion, or human trafficking. The question isn't just who did this to you. It's what they used your Moldovan citizenship for." I felt cold hearing that. Someone had turned me into a citizen of Moldova without my knowledge and had been using that status for criminal purposes. Gregory explained that Moldova, like several former Soviet states, had weak identity verification systems and corruption problems that made it relatively easy to create fraudulent citizenship records. Criminal organizations exploited this by registering people who had no idea they were being used. Sometimes they stole identities from data breaches. Sometimes they targeted specific individuals for reasons that weren't immediately obvious. Gregory said he'd need to file Freedom of Information requests with multiple agencies to get the full documentation of my supposed Moldovan citizenship. He'd also need to contact the Moldovan embassy to determine what records they had. The process would take weeks and cost thousands of dollars. I authorized him to proceed because I had no choice. Without a passport, I couldn't travel internationally. Without resolving this fraud, my identity was compromised in ways I couldn't predict. Gregory's first discovery came 3 days later, when he received a response from the State Department's Fraud Division. They'd located the original citizenship registration documents filed with Moldova's embassy in 2019. According to those documents, I'd applied for citizenship by descent, claiming my grandmother was born in Moldova and that I was entitled to citizenship through her bloodline. The application included a copy of my birth certificate, my social security card, and a notarized statement supposedly signed by me declaring my intent to claim Moldovan citizenship. Gregory showed me scanned copies of these documents over a video call. The birth certificate and social security card were legitimate copies of my real documents, but the notarized statement was signed with a signature that looked nothing like mine. Someone had forged my signature badly, and a notary public named Victor Roos had notarized it anyway. Gregory had already started researching Victor Roos and found that he was a notary working out of a small office in Washington, D.C. that primarily served the Moldovan immigrant community. Victor had notarized thousands of documents over the past decade, many related to citizenship applications. Gregory suspected Victor was complicit in the fraud, either knowingly notarizing fake signatures or actively participating in creating fraudulent applications. The claim about my grandmother being born in Moldova was completely false. My grandmother was born in Boston in 1942 and had never left the United States. But the Moldovan authorities had apparently accepted the application without verifying any of the information. They'd issued me a citizenship certificate and a passport that was now active in their system. Gregory said we needed to pursue 2 parallel tracks. First, prove to U.S. authorities that the citizenship registration was fraudulent so I could get my American passport. Second, work with Moldovan authorities to have the fraudulent citizenship revoked and to identify who had actually filed the application. The first track would be straightforward with proper documentation. The second track would be much harder because Moldova had limited resources for investigating fraud, and corruption was endemic in their bureaucracy. Gregory filed a formal fraud complaint with the State Department, including documentation proving my grandmother's actual birthplace, and a forensic analysis showing the signature on the notarized statement wasn't mine. He also filed a complaint with the National Notary Association against Victor Roos for notarizing a fraudulent document. Then, he contacted the Moldovan embassy to request all records related to my citizenship application. The embassy response came 2 weeks later and revealed something that transformed the case from simple identity theft into something far more disturbing. According to Moldovan records, my citizenship had been used to register a business in Chisinau, Moldova's capital city. The business was called Brennan Consulting Services and was supposedly owned by me. It had been operating since 2019 and had financial transactions totaling over $4 million flowing through its accounts. The business was registered at an address in downtown Chisinau and listed me as the sole proprietor and director. Gregory showed me the business registration documents and bank statements he'd obtained through legal channels. The paperwork showed monthly deposits and withdrawals in amounts ranging from $50,000 to $300,000. The transactions originated from accounts in Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. The pattern suggested money laundering. Someone was using my identity and my fraudulent Moldovan citizenship to move money internationally through a country with weak financial oversight. Gregory said this was worse than he'd initially thought. I wasn't just a victim of identity theft. I was potentially implicated in financial crimes I knew nothing about. If authorities in Moldova or other countries investigated Brennan Consulting Services, they'd find documentation linking everything to me. My name, my date of birth, my social security number. I could be accused of operating an illegal money laundering operation. Gregory said we needed to act aggressively and immediately. He filed a criminal complaint with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, providing all the documentation we'd gathered. He also filed complaints with Interpol and with Moldovan law enforcement. We needed to establish a clear record that I was a victim of fraud before any criminal investigation circled back to implicate me. The FBI assigned an agent named Raymond Cross to investigate. He came to Seattle to interview me in person and spent 4 hours asking detailed questions about my background, my finances, my employment, and any connections I might have to Eastern Europe or to people from that region. I answered everything honestly and provided access to my financial records to prove I'd never received any money from the fraudulent Moldovan business. Raymond was thorough and professional, and by the end of the interview, he seemed convinced I was a genuine victim. He explained that the FBI had been tracking financial fraud schemes involving Moldova and several other former Soviet states for years. Criminal organizations used these countries as financial havens because their banking regulations were weak and enforcement was inconsistent. The organizations would register businesses using stolen American identities, then use those businesses to launder money from various illegal activities including drug trafficking, arms dealing, and human smuggling. The American identities added legitimacy to the transactions because U.S. citizens were generally trusted in international banking. Raymond said, my case fit the pattern perfectly. Someone had stolen my identity, registered me as a Moldovan citizen, and created a business in my name specifically to move illegal money. The operation was sophisticated and well organized, not the work of amateur criminals. Raymond said the FBI would investigate who was behind Brennan Consulting Services and would work with Moldovan authorities to shut down the operation. But he warned that international investigations were slow and complex, and that it might be years before anyone was arrested. In the meantime, I needed to protect myself from potential legal liability. Gregory advised me to retain a criminal defense attorney just in case I was ever charged with anything related to the Moldovan business. I hired a lawyer named Veronica Shah, who specialized in international financial crimes. Veronica reviewed all the documentation and agreed with Gregory's assessment. I was clearly a victim, but victims of identity theft sometimes got caught up in criminal investigations anyway, because authorities didn't always distinguish between the person whose identity was stolen and the criminal using that identity. Veronica said we needed to be proactive in documenting my innocence. She worked with the FBI to provide additional records, proving I'd been in the United States during times when the Moldovan business was conducting transactions. She obtained my employment records, my credit card statements, my phone location data, anything that would establish I couldn't have been operating a business in Moldova. The investigation expanded over the following months as the FBI uncovered more details about the criminal network behind Brennan Consulting Services. Raymond Cross kept me updated on major developments. The business in Moldova was one of dozens created using stolen American identities. The network had registered over 80 fraudulent businesses across Moldova, Belarus, and Ukraine, moving an estimated $200 million over 5 years. The money came from Russian organized crime groups and was being laundered through these fake businesses before being transferred to accounts in Western Europe and the Middle East. The mastermind behind the operation was a man named Vitaly Lupescu, a Moldovan national with connections to organized crime throughout Eastern Europe. Vitaly had a network of associates who handled different aspects of the scheme. Some stole American identities from data breaches and dark web marketplaces. Others created the fraudulent citizenship documents and business registrations. Others managed the financial transactions and banking relationships. The operation was professional and had operated successfully for years because Moldova's authorities either couldn't or wouldn't investigate effectively. The FBI believed corruption within Moldova's government had protected the operation from scrutiny. Raymond told me that Vitaly Lupescu had been on Interpol's wanted list for other crimes, but had never been arrested because he moved between countries that didn't cooperate with international law enforcement. The FBI was working with Moldovan authorities to locate him and shut down his network, but progress was slow. I asked Raymond what would happen to my fraudulent citizenship and the business registered in my name. He said the FBI had provided evidence to Moldovan authorities proving the citizenship was fraudulent and requesting that both the citizenship and the business registration be revoked. But Moldova's bureaucracy moved slowly, and there was no guarantee they'd act quickly. In the meantime, I was still listed as a Moldovan citizen in their records and as the owner of a money laundering operation. The State Department had agreed to issue me a new U.S. passport after reviewing the fraud evidence, but the passport came with a notation in their system flagging my case because of the ongoing investigation. Raymond warned that I might face additional scrutiny when traveling internationally until everything was fully resolved. 6 months into the investigation, I received an unexpected call from a woman who identified herself as Elena Radu, a journalist with a Romanian investigative news organization. She said she'd been investigating Vitaly Lupescu's criminal network for 2 years and had obtained leaked documents from Moldova's citizenship office showing my name among dozens of Americans who'd been fraudulently registered as citizens. Elena wanted to interview me for a story she was writing about the scheme. I was hesitant about speaking to the media, but Gregory and Veronica both advised that telling my story publicly might actually help protect me. If the story went public, it would be harder for anyone to later claim I was complicit in the crimes. I agreed to speak with Elena, and she conducted the interview over an encrypted video call. She was based in Bucharest and had been covering corruption and organized crime in Eastern Europe for a decade. Elena explained that Vitaly Lupescu's network was much larger than the FBI had discovered. Her investigation had found evidence of over 200 fraudulent citizenship registrations across 3 countries, involving Americans whose identities had been stolen for various criminal purposes. Some, like mine, were used for money laundering businesses. Others were used to apply for bank accounts or credit cards. Some were used in immigration fraud schemes. Elena said Moldova's government was deeply compromised by corruption, and that officials within the citizenship office had been accepting bribes to process fraudulent applications without verification. She'd identified at least 3 officials who were working directly with Vitaly's network, but attempts to investigate them had been blocked by higher-level officials who were either corrupt themselves or afraid of the political fallout. Elena asked me detailed questions about how I'd discovered the fraud and what impact it had on my life. I explained the months of stress, the legal fees approaching $30,000, the fear that I could be falsely accused of crimes I knew nothing about. The violation of knowing someone had stolen my identity so completely that they'd made me a citizen of a foreign country without my knowledge or consent. Elena recorded everything and said the story would be published within a month. She promised to send me the article before publication so I could review it for accuracy. The article appeared in early September in both Romanian and English. The American citizens who didn't know they were Moldovan, inside a massive identity theft and money laundering scheme, ran across multiple international news outlets. Elena's investigation detailed how Vitaly Lupescu's network had stolen identities from over 200 Americans, created fraudulent Moldovan citizenship documents, and used those identities to establish businesses that laundered hundreds of millions of dollars. The article named corrupt Moldovan officials who had facilitated the scheme and included interviews with several victims, including me. The story generated significant attention. Other victims started coming forward publicly, sharing their own experiences of discovering they'd been fraudulently registered as citizens of Moldova or other countries. An advocacy group formed to push for systemic reforms in how citizenship applications were verified internationally. The U.S. State Department issued a warning about identity theft schemes involving foreign citizenship fraud and announced they were working with international partners to improve verification systems. The publicity created pressure on Moldova's government to act. Within weeks of the article's publication, Moldova's Minister of Internal Affairs announced a major investigation into corruption within the Citizenship Office. 3 officials were arrested and charged with accepting bribes to process fraudulent applications. The government also announced they were reviewing all citizenship applications filed in the past decade to identify other fraudulent registrations. Raymond Cross called me with an update. The FBI, working with Moldovan authorities and Interpol, had located Vitaly Lupescu in Turkey. Turkish authorities arrested him on an international warrant, and he was being extradited to Moldova to face charges of organized crime, fraud, money laundering, and corruption. Raymond said the arrest was partly due to the media attention from Elena's article, which had made Vitaly's network too visible for Turkish authorities to ignore. The case against Vitaly included evidence from my fraudulent citizenship and the business registered in my name. I would likely be called to testify if the case went to trial. I agreed to cooperate fully with whatever the prosecution needed. In November, Moldova's Citizenship Office officially revoked my fraudulent citizenship and removed all records linking me to their country. They issued a formal letter apologizing for the error and confirming I had never been a legitimate citizen. The business registered in my name was dissolved, and its bank accounts were frozen as part of the criminal investigation. I finally felt like I was getting my identity back, but the damage had been done. My name existed in databases across multiple countries as someone who'd operated a money laundering business. Bank records, business registrations, transaction histories, all linking me to criminal activity I'd never participated in. Veronica said those records would persist for years despite the official revocations. I might face questions about them whenever I applied for credit, traveled internationally, or underwent background checks for employment. The fraud would leave permanent traces that I'd have to explain repeatedly for the rest of my life. Gregory helped me file a lawsuit against Victor Rus, the notary who'd notarized my fraudulent citizenship application. The lawsuit alleged Victor had been complicit in the fraud and had notarized documents he knew or should have known were fake. We had evidence showing Victor had notarized hundreds of suspicious documents related to Moldovan citizenship applications, suggesting a pattern of misconduct. Victor's lawyer claimed he'd been duped, that he'd believed all the applications were legitimate and had verified identification documents that turned out to be forged. But our forensic analysis showed Victor had notarized documents with obvious irregularities, including signatures that clearly didn't match sample signatures on file. The case settled out of court for $85,000, which barely covered my legal fees but felt like some acknowledgement of responsibility. Victor's notary license was permanently revoked. The FBI's investigation continued expanding as they identified more Americans whose identities had been stolen by Vitaly's network. Raymond Cross estimated there were over 300 victims, though many would never know they'd been victimized because the fraudulent citizenship records existed in foreign databases they'd never access unless they tried to renew their passports or encountered some other bureaucratic flag. The FBI was working with the State Department to proactively notify identified victims and to help them resolve the fraudulent citizenship issues. I was contacted by several other victims who'd read Elena's article and wanted to know how I'd navigated the legal process. I shared what I'd learned and connected people with Gregory and Veronica. A support network formed among victims as we realized we were all dealing with the same systemic failures that had allowed our identities to be stolen and weaponized for criminal purposes. Vitaly Lupescu's trial began in Moldova in March of the following year. The prosecution charged him with 43 counts of fraud, money laundering, and organized crime activity. The evidence was overwhelming. Moldovan police had seized Vitaly's computers and found detailed records of the entire operation, including lists of stolen American identities, correspondence with corrupt officials, and financial records showing millions of dollars in proceeds from the money laundering businesses. I testified via video link from Seattle with FBI agents present to ensure the testimony was properly documented. I described discovering my fraudulent citizenship, the investigation that followed, and the impact on my life. The prosecutor walked me through documentation showing how my identity had been used to register Brennan Consulting Services and to facilitate transactions totaling over $4 million. Under cross-examination, Vitaly's defense attorney tried to suggest I might have knowingly participated in the scheme and was now claiming victimhood to avoid prosecution. But the evidence against that theory was overwhelming. My passport records proved I'd never left the United States. My financial records showed I'd never received any money from the Moldovan business. My employment records and phone location data proved I'd been in Seattle working my regular job during times when transactions were occurring in Moldova. The defense couldn't establish any credible connection between me and the criminal activity beyond my stolen identity. The trial lasted 6 weeks and included testimony from multiple victims, from FBI agents, from the corrupt Moldovan officials who'd pleaded guilty and agreed to testify, and from financial experts who analyzed the money laundering schemes. The evidence showed Vitaly had orchestrated a massive fraud operation that had generated over $200 million in illegal proceeds over 8 years. The jury convicted Vitaly on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison. Additional defendants who'd been part of Vitaly's network received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The corrupt officials who'd facilitated the fraud received shorter sentences in exchange for their cooperation. I felt relief when Raymond called with news of the conviction. Justice had been served, but the process had consumed 2 years of my life and cost me tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. I'd lost job opportunities because I couldn't travel internationally during critical periods. I'd lost sleep and peace of mind knowing my identity had been compromised so thoroughly. The conviction didn't restore what had been taken, but it meant Vitaly couldn't victimize anyone else for a very long time. Moldova's government implemented new verification requirements for citizenship applications following the scandal. Applications now required in-person interviews, biometric verification, and thorough background checks on ancestry claims. The changes came too late for me and the other victims, but would prevent future fraud on the same scale. The State Department also implemented new protocols for passport applications, including enhanced screening for potential citizenship conflicts and better coordination with foreign governments to identify fraudulent citizenship records. Elena's investigative reporting won several journalism awards for exposing the scheme. She continued covering corruption in Eastern Europe and stayed in touch with victims to document the long-term impact of the fraud. 3 years after my passport application was first denied, I finally felt like I'd fully reclaimed my identity. The fraudulent records had been purged from most databases. My U.S. passport was clear of flags and notations. Background checks no longer showed unexpected citizenship claims or foreign business registrations. But I never forgot the violation of learning that someone had stolen my identity so completely they'd made me a citizen of a country I'd never visited. That someone had used my name, my information, my identity to facilitate crimes I knew nothing about. The experience changed how I thought about identity and privacy. I became vigilant about protecting personal information, about monitoring credit reports and public records for any signs of unauthorized use. I joined advocacy groups pushing for stronger identity verification systems and better protections for victims of identity theft. I testified before a congressional committee examining citizenship fraud and its implications for national security. I helped draft proposed legislation requiring better coordination between countries to prevent fraudulent citizenship registrations. Some of those proposals were eventually incorporated into broader identity security legislation. Last year, I received a formal apology letter from Moldova's Minister of Foreign Affairs acknowledging the systemic failures that had allowed my identity to be stolen and apologizing for the government's role in facilitating the fraud through corruption and inadequate oversight. The letter felt symbolic rather than meaningful, but it represented Moldova's commitment to reform. Vitaly Lupescu remains in prison in Moldova serving his 25-year sentence. Several of his associates were extradited to other countries to face additional charges. The criminal network he built was dismantled, though Raymond warned that similar schemes likely continue in other countries with weak verification systems and corruption problems. I still have the original passport denial letter framed in my home office. A reminder of how quickly your identity can be stolen and weaponized, how systems meant to protect citizens can fail, and how fighting back against injustice requires persistence, resources, and refusing to accept bureaucratic indifference. My passport application was denied because someone made me a citizen of Moldova without my knowledge and used that citizenship to launder millions of dollars. It took 2 years and $50,000 in legal fees to reclaim my identity and bring the criminals to justice. But I got my identity back and helped dismantle a network that had victimized hundreds of people. Sometimes justice is expensive and exhausting, but the alternative is letting criminals win. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.